Mixtape Volume 3. Woo! Let's go.
I'm going to first bring up Danny Sheridan from Fern to talk about what's new in APIs.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Check, check. All right. Hey, my name is Danny. I appreciate you all being here today. I'm going to start with a little bit of context about where I came from, and then I'll talk about what I'm doing now. I was very lucky to spend the last couple of years at a company that most of you probably use called AWS. I was a technical product manager, and one of the things that I got to experience is how they build APIs. To give you a little bit of context, they have 270 software development teams building services like EC2, S3, SageMaker, and a lot of the other services that you probably use and love. One of the challenges is a consistent developer experience. And that's going to be some of the theme of what I talked to you about today. When you use the AWS platform, the vast majority of API calls come through SDKs. Can I get a quick show of hands if you offer client libraries or SDKs for your API? It looks like about half of you. At Amazon, there's just no way to keep, if you can imagine, there are like something like 270 specs for APIs, and they all have to feed one API documentation experience and one SDK experience. So they offered a Python SDK, a Node.js SDK, a C++ SDK, a PHP SDK, and I could keep going. And the only way that they were able to do that at scale was through API code generation. They built tooling in-house at AWS so that they could take an API spec and generate a lot of code. They generated code for their server. So they had boilerplate code to make sure that what they were serving for their API is what they promised. They generated code for their API documentation, and they generated code for their SDKs. I was very inspired by that because learning what companies do out in the world, very few are leveraging code generation today. So I just decided to start a company and change that. My company name is Fern. We are in the world of API code generation, and we are experts at client libraries. So if for your API you would like to offer client libraries, we should chat afterwards. That's what we spend our time on. We take your open API spec, or we've decided to invent a spec that's a lot easier to write that we call the Fern definition. I think in 5 years from now, a lot fewer of you will be using Swagger and Open API than you do now. But we take your API spec, and then we generate code from it. For example, we'll generate a Node.js SDK that we take care of publishing to NPM for you. No longer do you have to have polyglots on your engineering team. Some teams, and I'm going to pick on Seam, who's in the audience, another YC company, they use a team of contractors so that anytime that they need to update their SDKs, they kick off multiple different tasks or workflows. And that's how that works for them. The future of APIs and the economy that's burgeoning from it is what I'd like to bring two of my fellow Y Combinator batchmates up on stage to talk a bit about what they are building in the API economy. So the three of us just got to wrap up the Y Combinator Winter 2023 batch. As you may know, Y Combinator takes, in this case, 20,000 applications, and they accepted 280 companies. They give each of those companies $500,000 and says, go build. And so to talk a bit about that experience and what they're building, I'd like to introduce two of both my friends and some entrepreneurs, Zeno and Sandeep. Come up on stage. I think it'd be great to start with, like, what industry are you in and what do you do? Before we dive into some of the, I hope that we get a bit more technical in this panel. These are both engineers and founders, and so they're both responsible for building, documenting, product marketing, right? You get all of them in one person. So let's start. Zeno, who are you and what does your company do?
Zeno.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everybody. We're building an email API for developers. So you can think of it as a next generation SendGrid or Mailgun or Postmark. And the company's called Resend.
Cool.
Ooh.
Do you want me to go next?
I would love you to go next.
Okay. So who am I is a very deep question. I'm not sure if we'll get into all of that today, but
Let's start there. I actually want, both of you have some interesting work backgrounds at some good tech companies. So actually, Zeno, can I throw it back to you? Like, where did you work before this and what was your role?
Yeah, before that, I was a VP of developer experience at WorkOS. And before that, I was a chief product officer at another company called Liferay, which was serving more of the enterprise market. And we sold to McDonald's, Vodafone, Pizza Hut. So I've seen both the startup world and the enterprise world when it comes to serving developers in different languages too. In a Java ecosystem or in a Node.js and PHP or Ruby ecosystem. And they differ in so many different ways, right?
And earlier in her talk, Cece talked about one of the best developer experience documentation companies in the world, and she picked WorkOS as her example because they're a very SDK forward documentation experience. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. Sandeep, where'd you come from?
so, well, first I'll tell you my name, Sandeep.
Yeah.
I'm CTO of a company called Mercoa. At Mercoa, we're building the API for bill pay for B2B fintech platforms. So if anyone here familiar with like Stripe Connect, show of hands, yep. So Stripe Connect makes it really easy to let your users get paid by their customers on your platform. We make it really easy for your users to pay their vendors on your platform. So the opposite of Stripe Connect, basically. And so before this, I was an engineer at Stripe. That kind of tracks.
Yeah.
And then ran a few startups before, and then I was a developer advocate at Google for about 5 years. So that is my background.
All right, so both of you could probably get jobs as developer advocates at a couple of places. My hunch is if you went out to the market. Zeno, why'd you decide to start a company instead of just go get a high-paid job? Come on, you picked the hard track.
Yeah, especially with email, right? I feel like there's something about taking on a problem that people might not be super excited about and might not be a sexy problem. And you look into that and you're like, okay, how can we make this better? Or you go to an industry that is very established and you see something that has been done the same way for many years and you don't see as much innovation, even though that's something that people use a lot, and just try to think like, okay, if SendGrid was built in 2023, how would that look like? So for me, it was about just, seeing how far I could get and challenging myself in a way too, right? Yeah.
How about you, Sandeep?
Yeah, what he said. Yeah, pretty much, I love, my mom was a startup founder back in the 90s, kind of got the bug from that. I love building, and I love solving problems for folks, and I like that look of wow, you solved a problem for me. I think every job I do, I love doing that, and startup founder is, you're in it and experiencing that every day, and that's just kind of the best feeling. So that's from a personal side, and this is a huge space. I love fintech, and so just building in it is great.
And I'll share for myself, I got to see some magic that Amazon had within the walls of their company. And it was very clear to me after getting some years of exposure to that every software company should get that. But Amazon did not view it as a monetizable, externalized product. And so I decided to take one of those internal tools. I recruited 2 other engineers to join me, and together we are building Fern to bring API code generation to every software company. And after starting this company, I learned that Stripe built this internally. I learned that Twilio built this internally. Palantir built it internally. And if you're familiar with gRPC, Google built it internally. This idea around you have a well-defined spec or schema for your API. You start there in the API development process. You don't start in code. You start with the schema, and then you go and generate artifacts from that schema. Those artifacts can be server code. Those artifacts can be client libraries. And then you plug into someone like README to give you documentation as well. And so, Sandeep, at Mercoa, do you have a single source of truth for your API, and can you tell us about what it's like to add a new endpoint?
Yeah, so let me tell you about what happens if we don't have that single source of truth and what we were doing. So yeah, disclosure, we're a Fern customer, and we love them. So this is what we were doing before. So we would have a new update to an API endpoint.
Okay.
And so we're like, okay, what do we do? So we go ahead and implement that in our code, right, in the server.
And
then we're
what server framework are you using?
So we're using Node and Express.
Okay.
Pretty standard stuff. So we'd go implement it there, and then we're like, okay, we got to go change the front end and make sure that that matches up. So we'd go implement it there. Then we do the business logic, and then we would do like documentation, and then we would maybe, hopefully, someone would do client SDKs in all these languages that I don't know how to program in. And none of that happened, basically, right? Like maybe like you would immediately, all of this would go out of sync. No, not to mention documentation. Like that's another thing, right? And so now what we do is we update our Fern YAMLs, and then everything just boom auto generates. We have our like backend routes. We implement the business logic. Our front end SDKs all update. They push to npm and PyPy and Maven and all that stuff automatically. Everything is just like one spot, make the change, single source of truth, to your point, right? Mm-hmm. And the confidence, I think, that we get of like the front end, the back end, the SDKs are all in sync with a single engineering team, which is me, right? Like, that's been awesome. And we just hired our first engineer, and onboarding her was super easy because I'm like, you just make a change in Fern, and you just do the business logic, and then you're done, right? Versus like, here's the 25 million steps you gotta do to like update our API.
It sounds like there were 2 pain points that you're describing, Sandeep. The first is, I have drift. And maybe I can get a show of hands. Have you had drift between your API docs and how your API behaves? Yeah, like that's ridiculous. That's going to stop. And the question is, throwing like product management at that problem is just the wrong approach. The right answer is programmatically, when you make a change to your API, it should be reflected in your documentation and in your client libraries automatically. The second thing you mentioned is that it saves you engineering time. It's really hard to support a Ruby SDK and a Python SDK and a C# SDK. It's just very hard to be good at all of those languages and have those competencies within your engineering team. It makes much more sense to outsource that to someone else who can be great at each language, and then you get to leverage code generation that happens automatically. Zeno, do you offer any SDKs for the Resend API?
We do. And for me, when I think about SDKs and documentation too, I think many people might look at them as something that is adjacent to the product, or documentation as something that is secondary to the product. And I really believe that SDKs are the product. The documentation is the product. And when you look from that angle, then how you prioritize that is very different than how you would just like, oh, this is just the thing that we do after the API is done. So the way we do it today is the old way, unfortunately. So we have an open API spec, and then we generate different clients based on different needs. And it was a decision that we made just because we had specific needs within each framework. So in Ruby on Rails, you have something called Action Mailer, and then you want to connect your SMTP server with this solution. Or in Elixir, you have something called Phoenix, which is another web framework. They have something similar. So I love the idea of using code generators. I think that's the way to go. But you also have to be aware of the trade-offs of like, okay, what are your specific needs, and choose the right tool for the job.
So today you manually maintain your SDKs. Are all of those done by your team?
Yeah, so we had to hire contractors. We couldn't pay, for a full engineer to do that. And we need different contractors for different languages, which is a lot of overhead for sure. And a lot of coordination too. So we have to make sure that, hey, this was updated. Okay, let's make sure it's all reflected.
And from when you release new functionality in your API to when it's reflected in your client libraries, do you have some sense for what that time frame is? Both of you?
I think today, like within a week for us, but ideally, if it was instantaneous, it would be better.
2 minutes.
Yeah. And my belief is that that's what the future is going to look like, is that the client library functionality should perfectly match what the API is capable of doing. There should be no diff between those experiences. All right. You both have gotten to think about content marketing. I am continuously impressed by Zeno because I think that In the Y Combinator program, there were over 650 founders that we got to associate, befriend, and schmooze. And amongst them, I think the first-time founders really focus on product, and they want to make the best product ever. Second-time founders focus much more on distribution and understand how hard it is to build a following that is excited about the product that you're building. Zeno, I think that you've done, and I think your VP of DevRel at WorkOS is probably really helpful to how you've created this prioritization within Resend. But can you tell us about some of the content marketing that you've done, what's been successful? I'm especially interested in the wait list that you have.
Yeah, so we launched the product in January, January 4th. Within the first few days, we already had 2,000 or 3,000 people on the wait list. And today we just crossed 10,000 people on the wait list. So it's still a private beta.
Wait, I'm sorry. You have 10,000 people on the wait list. I thought you were supposed to get them off the wait list to make money. What's going on here?
Yeah, we bring like 100 or 200 users every week to learn from that cohort. So that's something that we wanted to do as a way to not bring everybody in. Everybody has the same bugs and issues, and they all have the same experience. We want to experiment with one thing or another for each cohort.
It sounds like a lot of what README Micro is doing with their release, how they're incrementally bringing on new customers. And Sandeep, how have you thought about content marketing or getting the word out about what Mercoa is?
Yeah, I think, so one of the things we did in the batch was we wrote a 26-page Google Doc called The Insider's Guide to Accounts Payable. And we're like, we have no idea if this is going to work. 26 pages is a lot to read. And we're like, our scheduling link was on the very last page. And we're like, you had to really want to talk to us. And we got way more meetings from that than we expected. And we realized that no one was writing content for product managers and developers. Yep. Everyone's writing content for accountants, right? And so there's a huge gap in the sphere of accounts payable content because people want to how do I build this product? I have no idea. I can look at the accounting terminology, but that's not useful for me as a developer, right? What API should I use? What tools should I use? What vendor should I work with? None of that was documented anywhere, and so it was like an oasis in a desert, right? And so I think content was an experiment that we ran, and we were very pleasantly surprised, and I think we're going to do way more of it.
On the content marketing, the most successful thing that we've experienced at Fern is getting right to the point. So we were able to leverage the Y Combinator social media publicity to get out a very short message, which was want a Node.js client SDK for your API? Give us your open API spec. And it was the most successful thing we've done today. We got a bunch of open API specs. We start generating code, and we were able to demo not someone else's API, but their API and show them what their client looks like. Just the most successful thing we've done is skip all the noise and just get to what the deliverable would look like for that customer. All right, I'm a bit curious about this Y Combinator world that you just got to exit. Y Combinator gives you $500,000 to go build your idea, and then at the end of the program, all three of our companies raised millions of dollars. So the question is, what's one learning that you took away from Y Combinator that you think other folks could benefit from?
Me first? All right. I think, especially during the pandemic, it was really hard to meet people. And you kind of forget just how important people are. I mean, it sounds stupid, but you meet someone randomly at a conference like this, the person sitting next to you, look to your left, look to your right, one of them's kidding. But you meet someone random, and you're just trying to be friendly and have a good time. But those relationships are really what make us want to live as people, and what help us grow our careers and our networks and friendships that can last a lifetime. And that was honestly the thing I took away from YC was just being in a room of 200 companies, 500 founders you said, or 600?
650 founders.
650, this guy has the exact number, I love it.
Yeah.
And every one of them is just unique and smart and really cool person to meet, and I just love that.
Yeah, I really learned about how to be vulnerable. I feel like as a founder or as a creator, you go ahead, you spend hours and hours on your computer building something, and then you show to people, and you want to project that image that what you've built is amazing and is flawless. But in reality, you know that behind the scenes, like things are burning. And
When we got into the program, they're like, congratulations on getting accepted. All of your startups are dumpster fires behind the scenes. We get it. Let's go put out those fires and build great businesses.
Totally. And I feel like just being comfortable with being vulnerable is extremely difficult. So I can tell like a personal story that I, like until that point when I met you guys in January in that retreat, there was this story of how I created a project called Dracula. So I don't know, are you guys familiar with Dracula as a syntax highlighter, like a theme for VS Code? Do you know what that is? So one day I was traveling, I was in Germany, I traveled to Spain, and on the way I started to feel really, really sick. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really, really sick. I go to the hospital, and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna be there for like an hour, I'll be all right later. Turns out I was hospitalized for 3 weeks in a foreign country by myself, crazy like environment. I never thought that would happen. But on the first few days, they bring my computer, and they're like, okay, I was already feeling a little bit better. I asked my coworkers, like, hey, can you go to the hotel, grab my computer? And they're like, okay, yeah, sure. So they got my computer, I was there, and then one day I left my hospital room just to grab some water, like for like a second. When I got back, my computer wasn't there. So someone stole me in a hospital, you know, in a foreign country. That was the only way I could talk to my family. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is insane. And I cried so much, I was like super sad and all that. And then eventually I talked to my coworkers. Luckily, my phone was like charging in another area of the room, so they didn't find it. And that was a story that I was super, you know, I would never share that story with people. I'll be like super shy about it, or I'm like, this is so personal, like I don't want to be talking about that. Turns out that's how I created that project. Dracula today, we have like 4 million users on VS Code alone with that project.
Shout out open source product development too.
Yeah, it has like 20,000 GitHub stars. It's a project that grew so much beyond what I could imagine. It's available everywhere, and it's pretty like, there's a Wikipedia page. So that's how you know that it's, like people use it, right? So, and you know, I shared that story with other YC founders, and it was something that I wouldn't do, but that just showed me like, no, like it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say like, man, it's like I'm not selling, I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
As a technical founder, I always go back to coding because that's my comfort zone, instead of talking to users, instead of selling or doing marketing or whatever it is, right? So I feel like just being vulnerable, yeah, it's important.
We've got, after one more talk, we've got a happy hour, and if folks wanted to come up and chat with you, what's one thing that they could talk about? We'll wrap up on this question. I will go first and then hand it to Sandeep. If you are thinking about client libraries for your API, you should come talk to me. I'm Danny at Fern. Sandeep?
I don't know if you want to talk about DJing, like, yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about how to get GitHub stars or how to do email using React, you can talk to me.
And with that, thank you very much to Greg and the README team for inviting us.
Hey, API, Mixtape Volume 3. Woo! Let's go.